Hey guys, welcome to the monthly Patron live stream for this month, where we're going to be speaking about Watchmen and House Dane. So those are the two videos that we're working on. Dane was chosen by patron vote, and Watchmen we're doing because the new Watchmen TV show is coming. So now's a good time to revisit that comic. And the Watchmen video is a really big project because it's a new series. It always takes a lot of time to really work through a new story and figure out what's going on, and really starting from nothing and getting to a point of being able to, be authoritative about it takes some time. But that's been a really fun process. Because, personally, I'm not super familiar with comics. And Watchmen is, in a lot of ways, a comic about comics, so I've kind of had to get familiar very quickly. But it's also just like a really cool story in its own right that is like, it's kind of like, like an 11th grade literature teacher's dream in terms of just the number of like symbols and motifs and themes and references, and it's like this intricate system that you can sort of unpack and unpick and see what's going on. So I think I'll talk about some more of like my favorite intricacies of the storytelling of Watchmen, and we'll also talk a bit about the Danes and show some of the imagery we're working with, and if you'll have any questions in the chat, we can answer those too. Welcome, Lucas, thanks for coming. Lucas says that he literally just got the whole Watchmaker Watchman thing. Yeah, look, there are constantly these ridiculous double meanings and visual sort of double meanings and references all the time. One of the things that they like doing is like watch and watch face. Because of course, like the main symbol of Watchmen is the bloodied smiley, the smiley with the blood on it, and that corresponds to the doomsday clock, which they also represent as this. Let me pull up the image, which they also represent as a yellow circle, and that angled minute hand, which is on the 11th hour, symbolizing imminent apocalypse. It's sitting there at the same angle that the bloody smiley is over the yellow face of the smiley face, in the same way that the yellow face of the clock has this thing going over it. So they're drawing like this very clear parallel here. They use that imagery everywhere with the face that watches, and then there's the watchmen that watch, and so on. And there are some really crazy repetitions of that image. So like, spoilers for the end of the comic, I guess. But here, when the alien monster destroys New York, you can zoom right in and see that one of the electrical plugs here has a splash of blood over it that looks just like the bloody smiley. And of course, the final panel of the series has some tomato sauce over someone's shirt that looks just like it. Even some really subtle ones, like the face of the owl ship, of Night Owl's little special vehicle, has these giant two eyes that look like a face. And here Laurie wipes dust off the reflection of Night Owl's goggles, in such a way that the smear looks a bit like the bloodied smiley. It's like at the same angle. And they're constantly just doing that. Like, they're constantly doing that just to evoke that same image, which, and of course, more important than and of course, what we've also got here is we're looking into the eye of Night Owl's goggles here. So the goggles are watching us, and it's reflecting back the sort of eyes of the owl ship, which is also sort of watching us. And there's lots of, sort of dialogue and such that sort of evokes that further. So the point is that, it's all about watches, people watching people, but also this motif of the smiley. And of course, more important than like the repetition of like the visual of the bloodied smiley is like the meaning of it. And I think what the meaning of it is it represents a kind of optimism and a kind of naivety and a kind of childishness that is broken and is complicated by the events of Watchmen, by violence that has consequences, and by relationships that are realistic in like a human way, and by realizing that these illusions that we had about heroes and superheroics, and about people being able to, change the world and good and evil being a simple thing, all of those ideas which are like so central to comic books, it's about them being broken and bloodied. And it's not just the smiley face that represents that. Like, you've also got this bottle of nostalgia perfume, which is manufactured by Ozymandias, and Silk Spectre here carries a bottle to Mars when her superhuman boyfriend teleports her there. Point being, at the moment that Silk Spectre, that Laurie discovers that her father is the terrible, amoral rapist, the comedian, that's when she throws this bottle of nostalgia that smashes against this building that Manhattan creates, and then the whole edifice comes crashing down. Let me pull that up. Watchmen issue 9. Yeah, I love this shot as the big tower that Manhattan created crumbles, and so does Laurie, which I think is just another sort of reflection of this idea of just something that was once, beautiful and positive coming crashing down. So, it's rather pessimistic. Watchmen is a deeply pessimistic story, because the heroes don't save the day. New York gets blown up. And supposedly, the world has been averted from nuclear annihilation, but the way it got there was through the actions of Ozymandias, who is someone who does terrible, terrible things for the sake of the greater good. He's like the Blood Raven of Watchmen, in that Ozymandias does awful things, but supposedly he's doing it to save the world. And whether or not you agree with his actions is up to you. So that's one of the central ideas in Watchmen is like the smiley. And one of the other sort of curious storytelling devices that they use is the Tales of the Black Freighter. So just like how a lot of those Shakespeare plays have like a play within a play, as just a little storytelling device, Watchmen is a comic book that has a comic book within it. There's a comic within the comic, and it's called Tales of the Black Freighter. And the idea is that in the world of Watchmen, since superheroes exist, and are all over the place, it seemed kind of unnecessary to have a whole lot of superhero comics within this world. People lost interest in superhero comics in this world. We know that, like, Superman what did exist as a comic book character in this world in like the 50s or whenever Action Comics #1 came out. But the history of their world diverges from the history of our world when the superheroes emerge in, I think it's the 50s, when the Minutemen start getting together and Hooded Justice appears. And so because of the proliferation of superheroes, Superman, the comic book, faded into obscurity, and pirate comic books became like the dominant kind of comic books. And so there's this kid, Bernie, who's reading one of the comic books throughout like 3 or 4 of the issues, and we get this sort of interweaving of the narrative within the Watchmen story and the narrative within the Tales of the Black Freighter story. And the Tales of the Black Freighter is about this mariner, who gets stranded on an island after his crew and after his ship is destroyed by this terrible, horrible pirate ship called the Black Freighter. And the Black Freighter is like this terrifying, inevitable, unstoppable force of destruction. It's coming to his home called David's Town, and he believes that it's going to destroy everyone. And it's closely tied to the idea of nuclear apocalypse, which is what's happening in the current day Watchmen in the present. So the way they use these Tales of the Black Freighter captions telling that story, like interweaved, braided in with the story of Watchmen proper in Manhattan, and all these people talking about their fears of apocalypse and stuff. So it weaves it together tightly. And the point is that basically what happens in the Tales of the Black Freighter is this mariner goes to extreme lengths to try and save his family and his town of Davidstown from this apocalyptic pirate threat. And he ties the corpses of his friends to his raft in order to make it float better, which is just like what Ozymandias does, because his former comrades, he screws over. He murders the comedian, and he frames Rorschach, and he gets Manhattan exiled by falsely accusing him of cancer. He induces cancer in Janie Slater and Wally Weaver and Moloch and these other people he's sort of associated with. So Ozymandias' plan to save the world is built on the corpses of his former allies, just in the same way that the Mariner, his attempt to save the world from the Black Freighter, is built on this raft made of the corpses of his friends. Like it's a pretty one-to-one, like, literal thing. Like they're both using their dead friends to further their goal to prevent destruction. So Tales of the Black Freighter is very linked to Ozymandias. And they make that explicit right at the end, because at the end, after Ozymandias has achieved his plan, and he's killed all these people as a way of ultimately bringing peace. And towards the end, he says, where is it? So Ozymandias is discussing what he did, and he's saying that I know that I killed all these people, but, like, you know, I'm not cold about this. It's not that I don't feel anything. Like I'm human. I feel what I've done. I know I've struggled across the backs of the murdered innocents to save humanity, but, you know, I've felt every death. I've meditated on it. I've felt it. I know that it's terrible. I am human, but, you know, I felt that it had to be done. But he says here, well, I dream about swimming towards a hideous... No, never mind. It isn't significant. And this links to the end of the Black Freighter story. Because at the end of the Black Freighter story, the Mariner, the main protagonist of the story, he goes to Davidstown, he goes to his home, and he's out there trying to stop the Black Freighter, but he thinks that the Black Freighter has already come. He thinks that his family is all dead already, and that his town is now inhabited by these pirates. So he ends up killing some of the people in his town, thinking that they are actually these evil pirates, when in actual fact they are his friends and family who he is destroying. And so in the end, the Black Freighter actually does arrive, and at that point, he's become a murderer, and he's been transformed into something unrecognizable visually and in his heart, because of the things that he's done, thinking that he was saving the world when he was actually just hurting the ones he loved. And so in the end, when the Black Freighter arrives, it arrives not to destroy everyone, it arrives just to take him, because the Black Freighter is like this ship of the damned type deal, and since the Mariner is now this unforgivable person, he swims out and he joins the Black Freighter. The implication being that Ozymandias has also essentially deluded himself by thinking that his destructive, murderous plan could possibly save the world, and could possibly bring peace, and could possibly be a justifiable thing. You know, maybe Ozymandias' plan really will work, and really will prevent apocalypse, but it comes at the cost of his humanity, and it comes at the cost of his soul. So Ozymandias dreams here of swimming out towards a hideous ship, just like the Mariner did. So you know, he is not being judged. He is not being judged mercifully at the end of this story. And judgment is, of course, one of the themes. I mean, apocalypse and nuclear annihilation is always associated with judgment, the end of days, and Rorschach embodies that in a lot of ways. And of course, Rorschach in the end, he fails. Rorschach gets killed by Manhattan in the end, because Rorschach refused to keep the secret of Ozymandias's plan, so that the peace might hold. Rorschach refused to compromise, and so he died. Which seems to suggest that, like, Rorschach is a failure. Rorschach's ideology is a failure. He was too uncompromising. He was too inflexible, and so he was ultimately ineffectual. But at the very end, Rorschach's journal is recovered by this right-wing newspaper, and this local schlup who works there is reaching for it, and it looks like he might actually read it, and it's possible that the truth of Ozymandias' plan will come out because of the work and the investigations of Rorschach. So, just like a Rorschach test, it's ambiguous. It's up to us to decide whether Rorschach will ultimately succeed in revealing the truth, and whether that's just. Like, is it right to reveal Ozymandias' crimes if it risks nuclear annihilation if the truth came out? Lucas in the chat says, Ozymandias damned himself and corrupted his soul in order to save the lives of many, almost sacrificial. Almost like Jesus took sins upon himself to free others from him. Yeah, I mean, I agree, because I think the important difference between Ozymandias and the mariner of the Black Freighter is that the mariner of the Black Freighter thought he was killing pirates when he was killing his family. The mariner was straight up deluded and ignorant of what his actions truly were. Whereas Ozymandias, he tells us that, I have committed all these murders, and I know I was committing these murders, but I believed that it was necessary. He made a calculation that the evil that he was doing was worth it, whereas the mariner was ignorant. So it is different in that sense. But I think maybe that's a deliberate difference that encourages us to ask, like, does Ozymandias really know what he's doing? Is it possible to commit that sort of crime without being a bit delusional? I mean, let's be honest. This is a man who, like, dresses up like an Egyptian pharaoh, and calls himself Ozymandias. I mean, the story of Ozymandias, of course, is this poem about finding a great broken statue in the desert. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And it's about the delusion of hubris and arrogance and pride. And it's saying that, people who try to build a legacy that lasts forever, it won't. And no matter how hard you work to try and, live forever and leave a mark upon the world and to be powerful, ultimately it will always fail. And so the idea of Ozymandias suggests, I think, that there's something inherently, like, delusional or wrong about trying to have a plan that big and a scheme that grand. So maybe Ozymandias, he might know that he was murdering people, but maybe there's still something deeply delusional and misguided about trying to shape the world in the way that Ozymandias does, and in the way that superheroes do, and in the idea of, the very idea of a hero and the idea of a singular person being able to change the world. Maybe that just is inherently delusional. So, like with everything in Watchmen, I think part of why it's a good piece of art is that every character is subjective. I think everybody relates to different characters depending on what sort of person they are, and sympathizes with different characters and sees different points of view, because it feels like a psychology test or a personality test. Like, which of these characters do you feel most like? Because they're all so diametrically opposite. And I think the most relatable for a lot of people, I would think, would be Dan and Laurie. Because while Dr. Manhattan is this superhuman, inhuman god who is just so disconnected from humanity that he teleports to Mars and just builds things there because he'd rather not deal with humans. And Ozymandias is this, practically psychopathic, manipulative killer who is ultimately doing things for the betterment of mankind, but will stop at nothing to save us. And then you got Rorschach, who is this crazy, violent, bitter, traumatized individual who uses this like fanatical ideology of punishing evil as what sort of like keeps him going. A very intense believer is Rorschach. Um, but among all these extremes, like Dan and Laurie are basically just kind of regular people, and Dan happens to be someone who likes to dress up as an owl, and Laurie is someone who doesn't even enjoy being a superhero, really. She just sort of went along with it because she had a controlling mother, and then, it sort of becomes part of her relationship with Dan. They don't have these, like, extreme ideologies. They're just people trying to live meaningful lives, as I think most people are. So I really enjoy their story. It's in issue 8 and issue 7 that we get a lot of their story. I think a lot of what like Dan is about specifically is celebrating fantasy and celebrating poetry and celebrating feeling over like practicality, because one of the sort of great lessons of Watchmen, part of the point of Watchmen is saying that, hey, the whole superhero thing, it's a bit of a joke, right? Like a dozen characters say in a dozen different ways in this story that like putting on lycra and running around and beating people up at night, it's actually not an effective way to address the root socioeconomic causes of violent crime. Like, it's not really a super helpful thing to do, to go around beating people up in costume. And everyone acknowledges that. Like, Night Owl, Dan acknowledges that. But I think Dan's story, in a lot of ways, is about saying that, yes, like, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's childish. But you know what? Like, it's fun. And it's romantic in the big R romantic sense. And in the little R romantic sense. Because Dan and Laurie bond over their superheroics. And as it turns out, Dan he kind of needs it for sex, because he wants to feel strong and capable and potent by doing the superhero thing. That's what gets him going. And so I love that, like, I love that constant reference to like kink being like part of the superhero thing. Because we learned throughout the story that like a whole bunch of the people who were superheroes had like sexual reasons for being into it, or were in it for money or for fame or for status, and there's only like a couple of them who were sort of really purely in it for like making the world better. Which as we learned is misguided. So like we sort of learned that maybe the best reason to be a superhero is not to try and save the world, it's to try and have fun and do something that just feels exciting and personally meaningful for you. And that's how Dan and Laurie's story ends. They are kind of the only people who get a happy ending, because they take on new identities and they dye their hair blonde, and they decide to just run off and just be superheroes together. Silk Spectre decides to remake her costume and maybe wear a costume that actually has some clothes this time. And so they're being a bit more practical. I mean, carrying a gun feels, I don't know, a little bit ominous to me, but they embrace the superhero life, but sort of knowing the silliness of it. And like, of course, it's not just about superheroes. It's about fantasy and silliness and romance in any part of life. And I think what makes that connection is this story, Blood from the Shoulder of Pallas, that Dan writes in a scientific journal. Because of course, like there are these 12 issues of Watchmen, of the comic, but at the end of each there's like this extra supplementary text, and it's a text from the world of Watchmen. So the first few chapters are from the autobiography of one of the superhero characters, talking about like the history and his experience of superheroes. And we've got like Rorschach's psychology assessment, like Rorschach's file at the prison when he's taken in. And we've got this wonderful drawing by 13-year-old Rorschach, which gives us an insight into his like feelings about sex, because Rorschach is really twisted up about sex and women, and has a lot of issues around that because of his relationship with his mother and some of the shit that he saw. And we get all these different documents from the world of Watchmen, which I think is really fun because it feels like you're in the world, pouring through artifacts of that world. It's this very sort of like immersive thing, for want of a better word. Like you feel like you're actually investigating this world yourself by reading its primary documents. You know, you're not just having this story told to you. You are sort of part of the story by getting to read these documents. And you know, it makes it feel real getting to just see these artifacts. Like you get to see these files and letters and photos, and they all have a very personal touch relevant to the character that you're seeing. But Blood from the Shoulder of Pallas is a scientific article or an essay published in a scientific article by Dan in his like civilian identity, where he's writing about birds. It's what's the word? Ornithological, the study of birds. And what he's arguing in this essay is that it's all well and good to study birds in a scientific context, but if you study things too rationally and too distantly and too coldly, you lose the purpose of the study in the first place, or at least the heart of the study in the first place, which is appreciating the beauty and the majesty of birds and of life and of nature. So Dan tells a story about, you know, being emotionally moved by this owl that was flying above him, and you know, religious connections and Horus of Egypt, and you know, all these different sort of fantastical, romantic, transcendent feelings and meanings that birds have. And that should always be part of the study of birds. You shouldn't just be measuring, you know, scientific anatomical details. You shouldn't just be looking from a purely cold scientific rational perspective. You also need to have the heart and the poetry, and that is important, not only for, you know, giving the study purpose, but just for life in general. And I think the reason for this essay is to remind us that, you know, when Dan embraces being a superhero, when he says that, well, you know, it's not necessarily like a smart or rational thing to do, but it is something that gives meaning. It's the reason to do anything in the first place, is to have it make you feel something. And so that's what Dan is championing. And I think that's how Dan invites us to think about superheroes. And, you know, not only, you know, the question of like, you know, does it make sense to have superheroes in a world, but the question of like, should we read superhero comics? Should we read fantasy? Should we watch movies about Captain America beating up Thanos? And I think Dan's answer is that, you know, even if it's silly, it's fun and it's poetic and it's transcendent and it has meaning to appreciate something for that emotional reason. And so that's in contrast to the takes on like, you know, Ozymandias and the bloodied Smiley and all of those things. I think Dan is sort of the counter to that. So we get lots of counterpoints to like what the main argument is in this story. So I really enjoyed the storyline of Dan and Laurie. Laurie is not as developed as Dan. She's one of the less there isn't as much to say about her as some of the other characters. But that said, I did like her scene on Mars with Dr. Manhattan when she's trying to convince Dr. Manhattan to come and help save the world. And ironically, like, she convinces Manhattan of the value of human life at the moment that she had sort of given up on the meaning of human life, when she finds out that her father is the terrible comedian. I do think it's kind of one of the weaker moments, honestly, when Dr. Manhattan gets convinced in that moment that human life is worth saving after Laurie's realization. Because the point of Dr. Manhattan is that he's like this god who can see everything, and he doesn't know everything, but he almost does, and he's all powerful. And kind of the point of Dr. Manhattan is showing us that, someone who is superhuman is someone who is inhuman, because you need to have human problems to think like a human. You need to have human limitations. When you can see, the cogs ticking inside a human mind, it's hard to relate to them as a person. Life and death are unquantifiable abstracts, he says. Why should I be concerned? He drifts out of touch. And we get all of these flashbacks relating his life story and showing us how he's sort of become less and less connected to humanity, incapable of cohabiting safely, either emotionally or physically, and then he leaves. And, the title of I think the title of the third issue is A Judge of All the Earth. So Dr. Manhattan is also kind of a stand-in for God. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? There's a Bible quote at the end of that issue. And it's a quote from the moment before God destroys Sodom. Like, in the Bible, God destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because they are sinful, and so he punishes the people within by destroying them, and that's, connected to the idea of nuclear annihilation coming down on New York. So Manhattan is like God, and it's asking, what reason does God have to save us? And so in this issue, number 9, Laurie tries to convince God that humanity is worth saving, by telling the human stories of herself and her mother. But when Laurie finds out that the comedian was her father and she's thrown into despair, that's the moment when Dr. Manhattan actually decides that, yeah, maybe humanity is worth saving. And the way he describes it is by saying that, well, it's just so incredibly improbable that any human life could exist because of all the thousands of sperm that when it could have gone into the egg, of all the different relationships that could have happened. The idea that the comedian and your mother would have gotten together after what happened between them, the fact that you specifically, of all the people could have exist is just so astronomically unlikely and miraculous that I think it's something worth saving. It's like oxygen spontaneously turning into gold, and he's just saying that life is just so crazy and miraculous and beautiful that I think it's worth saving after all. Which, is fine as an argument, I guess. I don't see why the comedian thing specifically is necessarily what causes that revelation, but it's what happens, and Manhattan decides to try and save the world, which he fails at anyway. So what's God worth in this story? I don't know. So yeah, look, there's a lot to grapple with with this video. I thought for a while that it might be a good idea to split it into one video that explains maybe like the world or maybe like the basic plot, and then another video that sort of analyzes the characters, a little bit like we did with The Expanse. But I think we're going to try and combine it into one big video. And so the structure of the video, I think it'll introduce sort of like the legacy and like the cultural context of Watchmen, because that's so central to what it's about. I mean, usually with Alt Shift X, we mostly focus on the text itself. We usually don't talk so much about the context of it. But Watchmen is about comics, and it's about the Cold War, and it's about all of these very like specific cultural times and places. So I think we have to talk a bit about, why Watchmen exists and what it's about and what it's responding to. And then we talk about the world of Watchmen. That's the Dane video there, but we'll talk about all the, the technological and cultural and historical and political differences between Watchmen and our world. And then I think we'll go through each of the main characters, and just sort of analyze what their story's about. So we'll talk about Rorschach and about his deconstruction of the superhero character, and how his story is sort of about, basically how superheroes are a really bad idea. Um, and also about his sort of, extreme, inflexible, uh, black and white view of the world and his ambiguous ending. And then we'll talk about Dr. Manhattan, and then Ozymandias, and then Dan and Laurie. And I think that'll give us a good sort of overall sense of what the story is. And I think it'll be like between 15 and 20 minutes long. And it'll be done in like a week, I think. So it took a fair bit of time to get this happening. But we've been studying Watchmen pretty closely. So I think it's going to be a really good video. Lucas in the chat says, I don't think Manhattan will be a good god wherever he goes at the end. Yeah. Well, I think that, I think it sort of invites us to think about God the way Dr. Manhattan is. Like he does sort of invite us to wonder, what would motivate a god to create something? Is it because a god has, deep love for his creations, or is it because a god is a bit bored and like a kid with like a Minecraft game or something? It's just sort of a kind of idle entertainment to create these beings who are so much lesser than the god itself. It's like The Sims, people are not very nice to their Sims or to their Tamagotchis in I don't think in real life. So yeah, Manhattan is maybe as much meditation on what it means to be a god as much as it's a meditation on what it means to be a superhuman superhero. But I think we've rambled about Watchmen for long enough. Maybe we should talk a bit about House Dane. So the Dane video is, it's a smaller video than the Watchmen video. I think if only because there's so little information available about House Dane. I think I might have overestimated how much text there is out there about the Danes. I mean, it's kind of good that there isn't heaps, because it sort of gives us a lot more room to speculate and to guess at what's really going on. And there are plenty of mysteries. Like, for how few words are written about House Dane, there are many questions that we can ask. So we first get introduced to House Dane through Catelyn's reflections on the birth of Jon Snow. So we're told about Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, the deadliest of Aerys' Kingsguard, and his sister Ashara Dane, the beautiful Ashara Dane, who Ned met at Starfall after killing Arthur. And so Catelyn frames House Dane in like a suspicious way, where she thinks that maybe Ashara Dane is the mother of Jon Snow, and some people still believe that. Some Song of Ice and Fire fans reject the R+L=J idea. They reject the idea that Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen are Jon's parents. And they've sort of got this contrarian view that maybe it was Ashara Dane. And there's certainly that is something that is hinted in the books, is the idea that Ashara might be Jon's mother. I think that's meant to be a red herring, though. I think it's pretty clear, if only from the show, that Lyanna and Rhaegar are Jon's real parents. However, there are plenty of other mysteries around Ashara and the others. So, for instance, like, Ashara commits suicide. She throws herself from Starfall after Ned's visit. And we get lots of different explanations in the story about why Ashara did that. So, some people say that it's grief for her stillborn child, and some of them say that it's grief for her dead brother Arthur, and some of them suspect that maybe it's like rejection by Ned Stark, because there's rumors of Ned and Ashara having a romance, or something like that. So there are lots of different theories about what was going through her head. There's another sort of counter theory that it might have been Brandon Stark, Ned's brother, who Ashara had some relationship with back at the tourney of Harrenhal years ago. because Ned is not the kind of person who has a one night stand. From what we know of Ned, he's not someone who goes around fathering bastards, and he's not a big party guy. From what we see of Ned Stark, whereas Brandon Stark, his brother, we're told by Barbary Dustin that Brandon was never shy about taking what he wanted. And we're told about when Barbary lost her virginity to Brandon, and how George uses his favorite metaphor of a bloody sword being a penis. Bit of Freudian writing in there. And he's always saying that, a bloody sword is a beautiful thing. And so Brandon, the point being, Brandon was into sex, and he was impulsive, and he was never shy about taking what he wanted. And we know that at the tourney of Harrenhal, Brandon was the one who asked Ashara for a dance for Ned on Ned's behalf. Which, suggests that something happened between Ned and Ashara, but we know also that there was this interaction with Brandon and Ashara, and Brandon is maybe a more likely candidate to have gotten up to something with Ashara. And the reason, sort of the reason why people think that there's this ambiguity here is that Barristan Selmy in the books, he thinks that someone dishonored Ashara Dayne at the tourney of Harrenhal. And he thinks that person is Stark. And he doesn't say Eddard Stark, and he doesn't say Brandon Stark. So it could kind of be either. And one of the arguments for why it might have been Brandon instead of Ned is that Barristan really likes Ned, and Barristan seems to really respect Ned. And it seems unlikely that Barristan would be so positive towards Ned if he believed that Ned had dishonored Ashara Dayne, when Barristan had loved Ashara Dayne. Barristan had a big old crush back in the day, and he was always regretful that he didn't get to name Ashara the Queen of Love and Beauty in that tournament. So, the fact that, Barristan's so positive to Ned might be a reason to believe that it could have actually been Barristan, that it could have been Brandon, not Ned, who hooked up with Ashara that night. And some people even suspect that it might have been rape or something somehow coercive. Because Brandon is this, sort of hot-headed, impulsive figure. He was never shy about taking what he wanted. And the word dishonored might imply that something bad went down. Or even maybe consensual sex would have been considered dishonor. Because, Ashara was a young noblewoman, and they're not meant to be having casual sex. So there's a lot of different ideas about what went down. In any case, someone, apparently a Stark, fathered a child on Ashara, and that seems to be part of the reason why she committed suicide. One of the complications is that some people believe that Jon Snow is Ashara's son, but young Edric Dayne, Ashara's nephew, says that Jon is the son of... Wait, does he say that it's the son of Willa, or does he say it's the son of Ashara? I'm confused. Because we meet this kid, Ned Edric Dayne, in one of Arya's chapters. And he says that he and Jon are milk brothers because they both nursed from Willa. Yeah. Edric Dayne tells Arya that Jon's mother is Willa. And Willa is like this nursemaid at Starfall, apparently, who nursed Jon when Ned came to Starfall and to Ashara after killing Arthur Dayne after the Tower of Joy. And so Willa nursed Jon just as Willa nursed Ned Dayne, Edric Dayne. And the fact that they have the same name is so suspicious as well, right? Like the fact that Edric Dayne is called Ned and Eddard Stark is called Ned. And, Ned Stark had this connection with Ashara Dayne and with Arthur Dayne. So, some might suspect that Edric Dayne or Ned Dayne was named after Ned Stark. But I don't think the ages line up. because Edric is 12 years old at this point. Um, no, that is before Robert's Rebellion, isn't it? So maybe there is a possibility that Edric was named after Ned. But of course, the fundamental question is, what is the relationship between Ned Stark and House Dayne? Because Ned killed Arthur Dayne, and after leaving Starfall, Ashara Dayne killed herself, and there was a dishonor apparently on Ashara. So do the Daynes, did they see Eddard as a positive? Did they like Ned, or was he an enemy? And if so, how does Ned being called Ned Dayne fit in? Or is it just a complete coincidence and it's just short for Edric? We don't know. But also more broadly, what is the point of Edric Dayne as a character? A lot of people, like an idea that I really like is that Edric Dayne, he's 12 years old in the books, in the story at the moment. But if George R. R. Martin went ahead with his plan to add a 5-year gap to the story of Game of Thrones, if after the 5th book, or if in between the 4th and 5th books, as I think was originally the plan, he gave a 5-year gap so that Arya would spend 5 years training, and Bran would spend 5 years learning about the Green Seers, and Cersei would spend 5 years being regent. Edric Dayne could have spent 5 years growing up to a 17-year-old. And as a 17-year-old, he could have been a believable warrior at that age. And as a warrior of House Dayne, he could have taken up Dawn, the Sword of the Morning. Because, of course, House Dayne has this legendary sword that was supposedly carved from a fallen meteor. And it has all these special properties. It seems a lot like Valyrian steel, and yet it doesn't look like Valyrian steel. It's glowing, pale as milk glass. And at the moment, the sword, Dawn, the mystical sword, is just sitting and hanging on a wall, just waiting at the castle of Starfall until a worthy warrior of House Dayne will step up and take up Dawn. And, it's like a Chekhov's gun thing, right? Chekhov's gun is the idea that you don't hang a gun on the wall in a story unless someone's going to shoot someone. And, George R. R. Martin has talked about Nymeria's direwolves in those terms, saying that, well, I wouldn't include a pack of direwolves in the story if I wasn't going to use it. And I don't think that you would include a legendary, glowing, mystical, magical, mysterious sword in a story if you weren't intending on using it. And, it's always meant to be someone of House Dayne who uses it. And Edric Dayne is kind of the only eligible Dayne left, unless you include Darkstar. He's the other living Dayne, or unless you include Illyria, who is another of the siblings of Arthur and Ashara, but she's no warrior from what we've seen. So I think it's quite plausible. I think it's quite likely, this idea that young Edric Dayne was originally going to grow up to be the new Sword of the Morning in George Martin's original plan. But since he didn't do the 5-year gap in the end, maybe there will be no Sword of the Morning. I don't know. Maybe that'll be just one of the casualties of removing the 5-year gap. Of course, part of the significance of Dayne is the idea that maybe Dawn was the sword. Dawn was actually the original Lightbringer, because one of the kind of all we know about Dawn is that it's an incredibly ancient sword, and it was apparently carved from a fallen meteorite, from a stone that fell from the sky. And the imagery of like a falling star or a stone from the sky is deeply, deeply tied to the legends and the mythology of Azor Ahai and the Long Night. So, one of the strongest connections is the story of the Bloodstone Emperor in the World of Ice and Fire, which is the story of this Yetish emperor who murdered his sister in a similar way to the story of Azor Ahai killing Nissa Nissa. And he worshipped a black stone that fell from the sky. And in doing so, he caused the Long Night when the White Walkers came for the first time. apparently. Um, so a fallen star is associated with the long night in this story, and it's not dissimilar to like the bloody comet that we see in A Clash of Kings, and it's kind of similar to the story of Hugo of the Hill, the founder of the Faith of the Seven, who has 7 stars that come down from the sky and settle on his brow. And Hugo of the Hill, his name is sort of connected to Hakor and all these other like proto Azor Ahai figures that are sort of hinted at in the world of Ice and Fire. There's the moon in the sky that gets cracked open and all the dragons pour out, which is like a legend that Daenerys hears that's connected to the long night. It's just sort of this swirling nebulous cloud of mythology. That all sort of connects the ideas of falling stars, sacrificial killings, dragons, Lightbringer. That's all part of the story of what brought about the long night 8,000 years ago and what saved it. And you know, like the story that they want you to believe, or the story that they tell you the first time that Melisandre tells us, is that, you know, there was a darkness for some reason, and then the hero Azor Ahai saved the world with a flaming sword. But what the story of the Bloodstone Emperor and like this and the story itself of about, you know, the consequences of magic and sacrifice, like a lot of what that tells us is that maybe Azor Ahai and Lightbringer was not this figure that saved the world. It was maybe the figure that caused the long night and caused all of this horrible stuff. You've got like Euron Greyjoy doing some terrible sacrificial magic that is making him, you know, maybe a new Bloodstone Emperor. Maybe Azor Ahai is not as heroic a figure as we thought. But that's kind of a tangent. Like, kind of the point of Lightbringer is that supposedly it's going to be this sword that saves the world in the hands of Azor Ahai. And there's this question that is asked in the book series, which is, you know, well, where is Lightbringer? Stannis Baratheon claims to be Azor Ahai, and Melisandre has him use this enchanted sword that's all glowy and pretty and sparkly. But you know, Aemon Targaryen says it's not the true Lightbringer because it's no heat, it's only light, it's only a glamour. So it asks this question: where is the real Lightbringer? And I think that Dawn, the Dayne sword Dawn, is a really good candidate for possibly being the original Lightbringer, because we know that Dawn is ancient, and we know that it's associated with the Falling Stone and all of this mythology around Azor Ahai. And the story of like the ending of the Long Night in the North, the idea of the last hero, it sounds as though the creation of Valyrian steel might have been part of the story in the North of how the War for the Dawn was won. Maybe Dawn represents like the first of those like special swords that was able to end the darkness and save the world. Cause I mean, what else is its role in the story? Honestly, like, what is the point of Dawn if not to be Lightbringer? So, you know, is it possible that maybe Jon Snow will take up the sword Dawn as like his role as Azor Ahai, or will someone else take up the sword Dawn? Or maybe Dawn will not even play a role in the story since the 5-year gap was removed. I don't know. But there are further questions about what House Dayne's role in ancient Westeros and the Long Night was. So one of the interesting things about the Daynes is that they have these purple eyes, and they have these sort of like Valyrian features. And George Martin made a comment once that, you know, just because the Daynes have these sort of Valyrian features doesn't mean they're from Valyria, and it doesn't mean that they're like connected to the Targaryens. And those words by George Martin have been sort of like twisted and misreported a bit. There are a lot of people on the internet claiming that, you know, George Martin said that the Daynes are not Valyrians, but George didn't actually say that. He just said that they're not necessarily Valyrians because of the way that they look. But the point is that there's this idea that's popular online about what if the Danes are some kind of like proto-Valyrians, some kind of pre-Valyrians who were in Westeros years before the Valyrians came to Westeros? Which is, it's kind of a reach, but it's pretty tantalizing because we do know that there was some kind of mysterious shenanigans going on in Westeros before the Targaryens arrived. Specifically, like the High Tower was built on this foundation of oily black stone, which we are told is very distinctly un-Valyrian in its architecture, and this is fused black stone, is what it's called. It's not the slimy, oily black stone of the deep ones. It seems more like Valyrian dragon-fused rock, and yet we're told it's not the Valyrians that made it. So there's this idea that maybe there was some kind of super ancient civilization that came and built this. The most likely candidate being the Great Empire of the Dawn. The Great Empire of the Dawn, we're told about in the World of Ice and Fire, was this legendary empire that took over this huge chunk of Essos. And it seems as though those people might have been dragon riders, because the 5 forts, that's like the eastern counterpart to the Wall, are built of fused black stone, of dragon stone. So it seems as though this empire probably had dragons, and had it years and millennia before the Valyrians had dragons. And so it makes sense that, whoever built the 5 forts with this dragon stone may have also built the High Tower out of that fused dragon stone, this ancient, mysterious, non-Valyrian empire. And what I'm getting to is that maybe, like some people theorize online, maybe House Dayne is part of the Great Empire of the Dawn. They are like the remnants of this great empire when they came over to Westeros. Maybe that explains how the Danes have like this ancient, crazy, unique sword. And maybe that's how the Danes have these like Valyrian-ish sort of features without being necessarily Valyrian. And maybe that explains how the Long Night was won when, the people of the Great Empire of the Dawn came and helped win that war using their superior, magic and technology and dragons and whatever. And maybe the Danes are a reflection of that legacy. It is all very, it's all guesswork. But I think there legitimately is like some weight in it. I think it's kind of possible that is what's going on here. Because come on, like the sword is called Dawn, like as Milo in the chat says, the light that brings the dawn, the war for the dawn, the great empire of the dawn. Like it's not hard to think that those things might be connected. And why else have such a mysterious, curious family as House Dayne? So I think the overall structure of the Dayne video will be to first talk about like the legend, the founding myth of House Dayne, about the fallen star, and we won't go too much into the super speculation in this intro. We'll just use that to introduce the basic idea of House Dayne. It's in Dawn on the island of Starfall. They've got this special sword. They've got this position of the Sword of the Morning that carries Dawn. And then we'll talk about Arthur Dayne and how Arthur Dayne was this peerless swordsman and how he was, super respected and powerful, and how he was killed by Ned Stark. And we're going to ask the question of why was Arthur Dayne at the Tower of Joy? Why did Arthur Dayne feel the need to fight Ned? Like, if Arthur Dayne and his Kingsguard were there to protect the son of Rhaegar Targaryen in the belly of Lyanna Stark, how is that counter to Ned Stark's goals? He just wanted to protect his sister and his sister's child. Like, why couldn't Arthur and Ned cooperate? Why do they have to fight and die? And we know that Arthur was like the closest friend of Rhaegar Targaryen. And so, and we know that Arthur was there and was helping when Rhaegar and Lyanna ran off together. So surely Arthur knew and understood the relationship between Rhaegar and Lyanna, and surely they, if there was any kind of prophetic stuff going on that Rhaegar knew about, if there were any kind of secrets and mysteries and plans going on, surely Arthur also would have known when they were like close buddies who were sharing a lot of their secrets. So what what was Arthur's goals? What did he know? Why did he die? That's what we're asking there. And then we'll talk about Ashara Dane, and we'll talk about the tourney of Harrenhal when she apparently hooked up with either Ned or Brandon, or we don't know. And we'll talk about that whole mystery and why she killed herself. There are even some like tinfoil theories about Ashara Dane maybe being still alive somewhere. That might be interesting to touch on, although personally I don't think those theories are all that strong, to be honest. I will talk about little Ned Dane and his story about Willa being the mother of Jon Snow, which is just such a weird complication. Like, it was already confusing enough when some people say that Ashara is Jon's mother. Having some people say that Willa is Jon's mother as well really muddies the waters. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk a bit about Darkstar, who's the edgiest of the Danes, and he's involved in the plot to try and start a war between the Lannisters and the Martells using Myrcella Baratheon. And he's currently run off to High Hermitage at the end of Feast, and it looks like Abara Sand and Ario Hotar are going to go and try and bring Darkstar to justice. So we'll talk about what his role in the story is. Although, frankly, I think Darkstar is he's sort of apart from the rest of the story of House Dane in a lot of ways. You know, like Arthur and Ashara are sort of the same era and the sort of the ancient stuff. I sort of see Darkstar as being more of an element of the Dawn plot. But we'll see what to make of him. And then we'll move on to the sort of grander, more speculative stuff about, you know, what is the role of the Sword Dawn? What is the possible connections with, like, Great Empire of the Dawn and Azor Ahai and the myth of the Falling Stone and all of that stuff. And that, I think, will round out the video. So, yeah, and as Milo points out in the chat, yeah, like, Darkstar is part of, like, a cadet branch. Like, he's like a Dane cousin, not an actual, like, main family Dane. And, you know, of course, he sets himself apart from the rest of the Danes by calling himself Darkstar and being, like, this whole separate thing. So it might be fair to, you know, not talk about him too much in this video. So, yeah, that's what we've got going on at the moment. We'll close up this live stream shortly. And thanks so much all for joining in, and thanks so much all for supporting as patrons. The Watchmen video is the main focus at the moment. That'll be done in about a week, like by the end of the month is the deadline in my head. And thanks for your patience with the Watchmen thing. It takes a lot of time to get a new series video done. But I'm really excited about where it's going, and I think it's a really nice way for Alt Shift X to return with something that's a bit new, that's a bit different. The visuals will be quite different, because we're only using these panels from the comic book. We're not going to be using video from the movie or anything like that. So I think the visual style will be quite different. We're going to get to experiment with that. That's going to be good. Lucas says in the chat that it sounds like a huge video. Yeah, it's a big video. I'm going to try and keep it under 20 minutes. And I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'm really trying to, like, capture sort of the central ideas and messages and themes of Watchmen, and to try and introduce what's really going on in Watchmen in one video. And yeah, maybe I'll end up splitting it up. Like, maybe if the video just gets too long, we could divide it into, like, you know, maybe a character video and then like a sort of theme overall video or something. But I'd like to try and introduce it in one video. We'll see what we can do. And then the Dane video will be out, like, I think sort of like mid next month. It'll be fairly straightforward to finish that, I think. I just want to get the Watchmen done first. And then after the Watchmen and the Dane video, I don't know, we could easily do another Watchmen video, because the amount of, like, time of like research and notes and stuff and all the visuals that I've, you know, captured and gotten ready, it would make sense to do multiple Watchmen videos. But, you know, it just comes down to how interested you guys and the patrons and everyone is in seeing more. So if it gets a good response, we can easily do more Watchmen stuff. I will certainly be doing more Song of Ice and Fire stuff. We can hold another vote. We could do another sort of character video, theory video, lore video. His Dark Materials is also on the horizon. I believe that TV show's coming out in November. So I've been reading through those stories and taking notes, and I think we'll be ready to make some cool His Dark Materials stuff. There's also a possibility of covering The Expanse some more when season 4 comes out in is it December or is it November? It's pretty soon. There's more Expanse coming, so we could do more Expanse content. And into 2020, we could be doing Dark, we could be doing Dune, and all manner of stuff. So there's exciting stuff ahead. This Watchmen video and this Dane video are both going to be really interesting, I think. So thanks for being a part of it. We might also switch up. I've sort of been meaning to do this for a while, but we might switch up some of the way the Patron tiers work. So, like, I think we might make the live stream tier a little cheaper, because it'd be nice to make it available for more people. So I think we might move that from like $5 to $4, and then the $1 territory tier will raise up to $2, I think, because the way that the payment processing and stuff works makes $1 patron donations really inefficient, because like most of that goes to like just payment fees through like PayPal or MasterCard or whatever. So I think we might like change up those lower few patron tiers and change it to, instead of having $1 and $3 and $5, I think we'll just make it $2 and $4 or something like that. But yeah, well, I'll let you know when we change it. So anyway, thanks so much for participating, everyone, and we'll get these videos out soon, and have a good one. Cheers.